The Golden Globe winner was nominated for his work in The Disaster Artist. He lost, but that loss comes after at least 5 women have accused Franco of inappropriate or exploitative behavior.
She shared text messages in which he used abusive language and asked if she was retarded.
The impression he gave me of the industry deterred me from pursuing a dream.
The things that I heard that were on Twitter are not accurate.
At his peak, James Franco was everywhere. An Oscar nominee for 127 Hours, a Golden Globe winner for The Disaster Artist, the star of Spider-Man, the face of Hollywood intellect actor, director, professor, provocateur to the world. He was proof that talent could transcend boundaries. Every headline called him a visionary. Every studio wanted his name. But behind the applause, another story was forming. Because while Hollywood saw a genius breaking rules, others saw a man quietly breaking people. The teacher who blurred lessons into something else. The artist who turned trust into experiment. The star who couldn't tell where performance ended and power began. So who was James Franco? Really a misunderstood visionary or a man hiding behind his own mythology? How does a Hollywood icon become a cautionary tale? And when the masks finally fall, what's left of the man beneath? Born in 1978 in Palo Alto, California, James Franco grew up far from the glamour of Hollywood. His parents were academics thoughtful, reserved, practical, and yet, even in that quiet, book-filled home, there was something in Franco that didn't fit the mold. While other kids dreamed of belonging, he dreamed of becoming. From an early age, he was fascinated by the tension between intellect and imagination, between control and chaos, the same forces that would one day define both his art and his downfall. Franco wasn't raised to seek fame. He was raised to seek meaning. But when meaning met the screen, it ignited something unstoppable. In high school, he was a shy, gifted student excelling in math and science, but secretly drawn to performance. When he finally began acting classes at UCLA, something clicked. His teachers described him as relentlessly curious, fearless, and obsessed with transformation. To Franco, acting wasn't about pretending. It was about disappearing, dissolving the self until only the truth of a character remained. That intensity made him stand out immediately. In the late 1990s, Hollywood was dominated by teen idols with perfect smiles and easy charm. Franco was the opposite moody. Intellectual, hungry. Casting directors noticed the difference. In 1999, he landed his first major role in Freaks and Geeks, a show that would go on to become a cult classic. On set, Franco's dedication bordered on spiritual, where others joked between takes. He stayed in character, treating adolescent rebellion with Shakespearean gravity. Even among future stars like Seth Rogen and Jason Segel, Franco seemed carved from another world, the serious artist among comedians. But Freaks and Geeks was only the spark. When the show was canceled, Franco didn't fade, he evolved. In 2001, he transformed into James Dean, and for the first time, the world saw what his obsession could do. The performance wasn't imitation, it was immersion. He studied Dean's voice, gestures, even his breathing, until he seemed to channel the same haunted charisma that defined the original. Critics called it uncanny, and the Golden Globe that followed made Franco Hollywood's newest obsession. Then came Spider-Man 2002, his entry into global superstardom as Harry Osborn. Franco captured something rare, the wounded vulnerability inside a villain. The franchise made him a household name, but instead of chasing commercial success, he veered toward introspection, while others negotiated for sequels. Franco was enrolling in universities UCLA, Columbia, NYU, Yale, collecting degrees as if they were roles. He painted, wrote fiction, studied philosophy, and directed experimental films no studio would touch. To some, it looked like arrogance. To others, it was evidence of a restless genius, an artist desperate to prove that intellect and creativity could coexist in a business built on illusion. By the time he reunited with Seth Rogen for Pineapple Express 2008, Franco had mastered the art of contradiction. He could be absurd and profound, comic and tragic, stoned and philosophical, often all at once. The film didn't just revive his partnership with Rogen, it reintroduced Franco to the world as something entirely new: the scholar clown, the academic rebel, the artist who refused to be categorized. By the late 2000s, James Franco stood at a rare intersection, a man who had conquered both prestige and popularity, intellect and instinct. He was a painter, poet, actor, director, professor, a polymath in an industry that rewarded predictability. For a time, it seemed he had transcended the limits of Hollywood itself. But genius, as history often reminds us, burns brightest just before it burns out. And the same intensity that made James Franco remarkable would soon begin to turn inward, testing not just his talent, but the fragile line between creation and self-destruction. For almost a decade, James Franco was more than an actor, he was a cultural force. The momentum that began with Pineapple Express 2008 didn't just redefine his image, it solidified his status as one of Hollywood's most versatile and unpredictable figures. The brooding dramatic prodigy from James Dean had evolved into a performer who could make absurdity profound. Franco's comedic transformation wasn't a detour from art, it was proof of it. He brought emotional truth to farce, intellect to chaos, and depth to laughter. Audiences saw something magnetic in him, a rare combination of unpredictability and sincerity. In Pineapple Express, his portrayal of Saul Silver wasn't just comic relief, it was revelation. Franco infused the archetypal stoner with empathy, vulnerability, and strange wisdom. Critics and fans alike agreed he wasn't acting funny, he was making comedy feel human. That role became the spark that reignited his friendship and creative partnership with Seth Rogen, transforming two misfits from freaks and geeks into a phenomenon. The success that followed was staggering. This is the end. 2013 became a box office hit and a generational satire, a mirror held up to Hollywood's own vanity. Franco's willingness to mock himself, to turn his eccentric reputation into art, became part of his appeal. He was fearless, the movie star who didn't mind being ridiculous if it served the truth. Then came The Interview 2014, the defining moment of his cultural influence. What began as a subversive comedy turned into a global flashpoint, sparking international debate over art, censorship, and freedom of expression. Overnight, James Franco wasn't just an entertainer, he was a headline, a symbol of the uneasy power that film could still wield. In that moment, his reach extended far beyond Hollywood. But Franco's ambitions were never limited to comedy. The Disaster Artist 2017 proved that he could take what the world considered trash and reveal its humanity. His performance as Tommy Wiseau, strange, tragic, and oddly beautiful, earned him a Golden Globe and critical acclaim worldwide. For many, it was the culmination of everything that defined him: intellect, empathy, and an unflinching curiosity about the flawed human condition. By the late 2010s, James Franco had built something few in Hollywood ever achieved, not just fame, but myth. He could move effortlessly between worlds academia and cinema, mainstream blockbusters and underground art, irony and sincerity. To his admirers, he represented artistic freedom itself, a man who defied labels, who turned risk into reinvention. And yet, the same intensity that drove his ascent, the relentless hunger to push boundaries, to blur lines between artist and persona, would soon begin to cast longer shadows. Because for James Franco, success was never the end of the story. It was only the calm before the reckoning. The year 2014 would become the first tremor beneath James Franco's empire the moment the mask began to slip, even if no one yet realized what they were seeing. It started with Lucy, a 17-year-old tourist from Scotland who met Franco outside a Broadway theater after his performance. Their exchange seemed innocent at first, a fan meeting an idol, until the messages turned unmistakably personal. Franco asked her age, if she had a boyfriend, and suggested they meet at a hotel. When she hesitated, he sent photos to prove it was really him. She refused. Within hours, the screenshots went viral. To the public, it was scandalous. To Franco, it was just bad judgment. On television, he smiled sheepishly, calling it a lesson about social media. But the timing raised eyebrows. His film, Palo Alto, was about to premiere, with Franco playing a teacher seducing a teenage girl. Critics wondered if this was life imitating art, or art exposing life. Franco brushed it off as coincidence. Yet, for the first time, his charm no longer softened the story, it sharpened it. Soon after, more unsettling images resurfaced, an old photo of him embracing a 15-year-old fan from behind. Another of him half naked on Instagram, his hand buried in his waistband. What had once seemed eccentric now looked reckless, a man testing how close he could stand to the edge without falling. Seth Rogen, ever the loyal friend, deflected the tension with humor. On Saturday Night Live, he turned the scandal into a skit, pretending to catfish Franco by posing as the girl online. The crowd erupted in laughter. For a brief moment, the world laughed with them. But what played as comedy was, in hindsight, prophecy, a warning disguised as a joke. Rogen would later call that moment a mistake, a laugh he wished he hadn't earned. But by then, it was too late. The signs had already appeared, the blurring of boundaries, the deflection through irony, the belief that consequences were optional for the brilliant. In 2014, James Franco was still at the height of his fame, celebrated, envied, unstoppable. But every empire begins to crack quietly. And for Franco, the laughter that once protected him was already starting to sound like the echo before the fall. By early 2018, the storm that had been gathering around James Franco finally struck, and this time, no amount of charm, irony, or intellect could contain it. He walked onto the Golden Globe stage in a black tuxedo, a Time's Up pin glinting on his lapel, holding the award for the Disaster Artist, the film that was supposed to be his redemption. It was meant to mark the full circle of a misunderstood genius, from scandal to seriousness, from cult comedy to critical acclaim. The applause was thunderous, but before the night was over, it turned to disbelief. Within hours, multiple women came forward, first on Twitter, then in the Los Angeles Times, accusing Franco of hypocrisy and misconduct. Among them were former students from his own acting school. Studio 4, cute Time's Up pin. One post read, "Remember when you pushed my head toward your lap in a car?" Others described classes where nudity was optional, but refusal meant losing roles or opportunities. What Franco had called method teaching, they described as manipulation, a system that blurred lines between mentorship and control. When the Times published its expose days later, the allegations painted a portrait of exploitation disguised as education. Studio 4, the women said, had been less about art and more about access, a gateway to Franco's projects, but at a personal cost. Franco denied the claims, but his tone was clinical, detached, even rehearsed he was learning lessons. Re-evaluating boundaries. Once, that calm might have diffused outrage, but in the age of Me Too, detachment read as avoidance. The fallout was immediate. 2 students, Sarah Tither Kaplan and Tony Gall, filed a class action lawsuit in 2019 accusing Franco and his partners of fraud and sexual exploitation. His production companies were named. Studios paused projects. Awards campaigns quietly erased his name. By 2021, Franco agreed to pay $2.2 million in a settlement, not as an admission of guilt, but as an acknowledgement that the plaintiffs raised important issues. But outside the courtroom, the verdict was already sealed. The image that had once made him magnetic, the intellectual rebel, the boundary-breaking artist, now seemed like evidence of something darker. The very traits that once made Franco a darling of Hollywood's avant-garde had become liabilities. Ambition looked like ego. Curiosity looked like manipulation. The method had curdled into menace. Even his closest ally, Seth Rogen, could no longer defend him. In a 2021 interview with the Sunday Times, Rogen confirmed what many had already sensed: the partnership was over. His statement was short, but it ended an era. "I despise abuse and harassment," he said. "I would never cover for or knowingly put someone in that situation." For Franco, the silence that followed was absolute. He disappeared. No red carpets, no late-night interviews, no premieres. The man who once seemed to exist everywhere vanished into the margins, resurfacing only in obscure European films and private workshops. When he finally spoke again, years later, the world had already moved on. The fall of James Franco wasn't sudden. It was the slow unmasking of a persona that had been built on contradictions. He had once blurred the line between artist and character to elevate his art. Now, that same blurring had cost him everything. Once celebrated as a symbol of limitless creativity, James Franco had become something else entirely: a cautionary tale about how the pursuit of authenticity, without accountability, can consume the very soul that seeks it. After the lawsuits, the headlines, and the silence, James Franco tried to rewrite the story, not with another movie, but with contrition. In December 2021, he finally broke his 3-year silence on the Jess Cagle podcast. The tone was subdued, even weary. Gone was the confident provocateur of The Interview or The Disaster Artist. In his place was a man dissecting his own collapse. Franco admitted, "At last, what the public had long suspected. I did sleep with students, and that was wrong." He framed it as a story of addiction, not to drugs or alcohol, but to sex, to validation, to the chase. He claimed the problem began after he quit drinking as a teenager, swapping one compulsion for another. "I was blind to the power dynamics," he said. "At the time, I thought if it was consensual, it was fine." It was the kind of confession calibrated for empathy, part therapy, part self-defense. Franco described years of self-work recovery programs, introspection, learning how to listen. But for many, it sounded too rehearsed, too late. The language of healing couldn't erase years of denial. The timing coinciding with a slow career relaunch only fueled skepticism. He began taking small European projects and Italian drama. Hey Joe, a French thriller, The Price of Money. And, most controversially, the role of Fidel Castro in Alina of Cuba. Each appearance drew new backlash. His attempts to re-enter Hollywood felt less like redemption and more like exile in motion, a once celebrated artist trying to stay relevant by escaping the audience that rejected him. The apology tour didn't land because the world had changed. The culture that once forgave excess now demanded accountability. Franco's words explained, but they didn't transform. He spoke of healing, but avoided the names of those he'd hurt. And in Hollywood's new moral economy, redemption isn't about confession, it's about repair. Without it, every return feels temporary, every comeback conditional. Franco's story was no longer a scandal seeking closure. It was a test of whether fame could ever truly outlast consequence. In the years since the fallout, the two men who once shared a creative empire have followed radically different trajectories. Seth Rogen emerged from the storm stronger, not untouched, but evolved. His decision to publicly distance himself from James Franco became more than damage control. It became a statement of values. In interviews, he no longer spoke about brotherhood or collaboration, but about ethics, accountability, and safe work environments. Hollywood took notice, far from being punished for breaking loyalty. Rogen was rewarded for his clarity. His production company, Point Grey Pictures, thrived. He transitioned from stoner comedies to acclaimed projects like The Boys and Platonic, solidifying his reputation as a modern creative executive, proof that you could be funny and responsible at the same time. James Franco, meanwhile, receded into the periphery. The awards, the think pieces, the endless curiosity about his artistic process, all gone. In their place, a quiet, uncertain existence marked by small, independent films and the occasional controversy over casting choices. For many, his name now evokes unease rather than admiration, a reminder of how thin the line between brilliance and blindness can be. Their split marked more than the end of a friendship. It symbolized a generational reckoning in Hollywood. The days when personal loyalty outweighed professional accountability were over. Franco's downfall was no longer viewed in isolation. It became part of the larger Me Too mosaic, a cultural document of how fame, power, and denial can corrupt even the most beloved figures. In that sense, their story endures not as gossip, but as a lesson. That laughter doesn't absolve responsibility. That talent doesn't excuse abuse. And that even the brightest partnerships can fracture when truth finally demands its due. In the end, the story of James Franco and Seth Rogen isn't just about fame or failure. It's about how time rewrites even the strongest bonds. What began as a friendship that reshaped comedy became a mirror for Hollywood itself, the intoxicating rise, the moral reckoning, the quiet aftermath. Franco once represented artistic fearlessness, the actor who could do anything. Rogen represented authenticity, the friend who made the absurd feel human. Together, they built something rare, a partnership that felt like trust. But when that trust fractured, the world saw what Hollywood so often hides, that behind the laughter, there are lines that can't be crossed, and once crossed, can't be repaired. 2 decades of loyalty ended not with betrayal, but with silence. One man choosing conscience over companionship, the other introspection over applause. And between them lies a question that every story like this eventually asks. Can art ever truly separate itself from the artist? Can we still laugh at the films that once defined a friendship, now broken by consequence? Or, perhaps more painfully, do we even want to? Because when the camera turns off and the audience leaves, what remains isn't the fame or the laughter. It's the echo of what used to be and the silence of what's been lost.